The monitor screamed at 3:47 a.m., and Edward Vance knew this was the sound of his world ending. His son, his only son, was dying again, the fourth time this week, and the doctors were already running toward the private suite with that look on their faces, the one that said they were tired of bringing Daniel back when they knew he wouldn't last. Edward's hands shook as he pressed against the glass window, separating him from the sterile room where machines breathed for the boy who used to laugh, used to run, used to beg his father to play catch in the gardens behind their estate. That child was gone now, replaced by a skeleton with tubes running in and out of his small body, skin like wax paper stretched over fragile bones, lips cracked and colorless. The richest man in 3 states stood in a hospital hallway at nearly 4 in the morning, and his billions meant absolutely nothing. Hello, my wonderful friends. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Where are you watching from right now? Are you settled in? Have you hit that subscribe button yet? If not, please do it now because this story is going to take you somewhere you won't expect. And I don't want you to miss what happens next. Trust me on this one. Now, let me take you back into that room where hope was gasping its last breath. The lead physician, Dr. Reeves, emerged from Daniel's room with his surgical mask pulled down, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and Edward didn't need to hear the words to know what was coming. We stabilized him again, Mr. Vance, but his body is shutting down. The disease is accelerating. I've consulted with every specialist from Johns Hopkins to Zurich, and they all say the same thing. Edward turned away, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, because if he looked at Dr. Reeves, he might break down completely. And Edward Vance had built an empire by never showing weakness, never admitting defeat. But that was before he learned that some battles can be won with power, or money, or sheer force of will. Down the hallway, past the nurse's station where staff whispered prayers they thought no one heard, past the waiting room where Edward's ex-wife Catherine had finally collapsed into medicated sleep after 72 hours of vigil. Someone else was praying too. Lina Wolfe knelt in the hospital chapel, her worn hands clasped together, her uniform still damp from scrubbing the Vance estate floors earlier that evening, because even though the family hadn't been home in 6 weeks, she kept the house perfect, kept Daniel's room exactly as he'd left it. His soccer trophies dusted, his bed made with the superhero sheets he loved, everything waiting for a boy who might never come home. She had watched Daniel Vance since the day Edward brought him home as a newborn, had been the one to kiss his scraped knees, to make him hot chocolate when nightmares woke him, to teach him to pray before bedtime while his father worked late and his mother attended another charity gala. The doctors had fancy degrees and miracle drugs, but Lina had something they didn't. She had loved that boy for 11 years, and she wasn't ready to let him go. The chapel was empty, except for her and the small flickering candles near the altar, and she whispered the same words she'd been whispering for months, begging for intervention, for mercy, for one more chance. What she didn't know was that upstairs, in room 847, Daniel's monitor had just gone from steady beeping to that long, horrible tone that meant his heart had stopped. And this time the doctors were moving slower, exchanging glances that said, maybe it was time to let the child rest. Maybe they'd done all they could. Edward burst through the door anyway, his voice breaking as he shouted his son's name, and the crash cart came rushing in, and someone was counting compressions. And the whole scene was chaos and desperation and the smell of antiseptic mixed with fear. But down in that chapel, Lina suddenly felt something. A pull, an urgency, a voice that wasn't a voice telling her to go now, go right now, and she didn't question it. Just ran for the elevator, her heart pounding, her breath coming in gasps. She had no credentials to be in that room, No medical knowledge, no permission. But when she reached the 8th floor and saw Edward collapsed against the wall outside Daniel's room, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. While inside the room, the medical team was stepping back from the bed, their efforts finally exhausted. Lina didn't hesitate. She pushed through the door, ignoring the startled looks from the nurses, and walked straight to Daniel's bedside. And before anyone could stop her, she placed both her hands on the dying child's chest and began to pray out loud, her voice steady and strong, and filled with a faith that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with miracles. The head nurse reached for her, about to pull her away, but Edward's voice cut through the room, raw and broken. "Let her!" So they did, and for 37 seconds the only sound was Lina's prayer and the flatline monitor's monotone scream. And then something happened that would make those doctors question everything they thought they knew about life and death, and the space between where science ends and something else begins. The monitor flickered, just once, and could a maid's whispered prayer really do what 1,000 doctors and $1 billion couldn't? 6 months before the monitors screamed that night, Daniel Vance had been a whirlwind of energy, a skinny 11-year-old who collected rocks from the estate gardens and left them in Lina's apron pockets, with handwritten notes that said things like, "This one looks like a dragon egg," or, "For your collection, Lina." And she'd kept every single one in a mason jar by her bedside in the small cottage behind the main house where she'd lived for 12 years. Edward remembered the exact moment everything changed. The afternoon Daniel came home from soccer practice complaining about tiredness, how Edward had barely looked up from his laptop, had muttered something about drinking more water and eating better, because Edward Vance was always half present, always building the next deal, expanding Vance Industries into new markets. And he told himself that working this hard was for Daniel's future, for the empire he'd inherit. But the truth Edward couldn't face was that work was easier than being a father, easier than the messy vulnerability of actually connecting with his son after the divorce from Catherine had turned their family into a battlefield. Catherine Stratton, she'd taken back her maiden name, had been a surgical nurse when Edward met her, beautiful and sharp-tongued, and unimpressed by his money, which was exactly why he'd fallen for her. But 15 years of marriage to a man who loved his company more than his wife had turned her bitter, and their split 3 years ago had been nuclear. All lawyers and accusations, and Daniel caught in the middle, spending weekdays with Edward and weekends with Catherine in her downtown penthouse, both parents showering him with gifts instead of presents, with expensive toys instead of time. Lina had been the constant, the one who actually listened when Daniel talked about his day at school, who helped with homework at the kitchen table, who noticed when he started losing weight before anyone else did, who'd begged Edward to take the boy to a doctor weeks before he finally did. Edward's deepest fear wasn't death, wasn't losing his fortune, wasn't failure in business. It was that he'd already lost his son years ago through neglect. And now God or the universe or whatever force governed these things was making that loss permanent, was taking Daniel away before Edward could make it right, before he could become the father he should have been all along. That terror lived in his chest like a stone, and the guilt was worse. The knowledge that he'd wasted years chasing deals in Beijing and Singapore, while his son grew up in the care of a maid who earned $38,000 a year and loved Daniel more than Edward knew how to show. Lina Wolfe had secrets of her own, though nobody in the Vance household knew them, because she never spoke about her past, never mentioned that she'd had a son once too. 23 years ago, a baby boy born too early who'd lived for just 4 days before his lungs gave out, or that his father had left before the child was even born, or that she'd named him Gabriel and still visited his grave every Sunday after church with fresh flowers. She'd never married, never had other children, and when the grief threatened to drown her, she'd poured all that unused maternal love into other people's children, working as a nanny and then a housekeeper. And when she'd met baby Daniel for the first time, had held that tiny perfect newborn, while Catherine recovered from her C-section and Edward paced the hospital hallway on a conference call. Something in her broken heart had mended just a little. Daniel became her purpose, her second chance, and she'd loved him fiercely and quietly, never overstepping, never trying to replace Catherine, just being there in all the small moments that busy parents missed. Dr. Richard Reeves had his own stake in this nightmare because he'd promised Edward 6 months ago that they'd beat this, that Vance money could access experimental treatments, the best research facilities, trials not available to ordinary patients, and Reeves had genuinely believed it because he'd built his career on solving impossible cases, on being the doctor who succeeded where others failed. But Daniel's condition, a rare genetic disorder that was literally 1 in 8 million, that destroyed cells faster than any treatment could repair them, had humbled him completely. Reeves had a daughter Daniel's age, and every time he looked at that dying boy, he saw his own child in that bed, and the helplessness was eating him alive, making him doubt everything he'd spent 20 years learning. Catherine hadn't slept more than a few hours in weeks, surviving on coffee and prescription anxiety medication, her once perfect appearance now haggard, her designer clothes hanging loose because she'd forgotten to eat. And though she and Edward could barely speak to each other without old resentments surfacing, grief had created a strange truce between them. A shared vigil where their failed marriage didn't matter anymore, because the only thing that mattered was the child they'd made together, the beautiful boy who was slipping away despite everything they tried. What nobody understood was that Daniel himself had stopped fighting 2 weeks ago, had quietly accepted that he was dying, and in his few conscious moments he'd worried most about what would happen to Lina, whether his parents would let her stay in the cottage, whether she'd be okay without him. Because even at 11, Daniel Vance had his father's sharp mind and his mother's tender heart, and he'd known for years that Lina needed him as much as he needed her. If you're feeling this story in your chest right now, drop a comment below and tell me about someone who showed up for you when it mattered most. I read every single one. I promise. The monitor had flickered once, and now in that suspended moment with Lina's hands on Daniel's chest and her prayer hanging in the sterile air, Edward felt something crack open inside him, some hard shell he'd built around his heart to survive the business world, to negotiate ruthlessly, to win at all costs. And for the first time in decades, he found himself praying too. Not the formal prayers from his childhood, but desperate bargaining, offering anything, everything, his entire fortune, his own life in exchange for his son's, and he meant it with every atom of his being. Catherine had pushed into the room behind Lina, awakened by some maternal instinct, and now stood frozen watching the scene, and the question hanging over all of them was whether faith could actually accomplish what science had declared impossible, and whether they were about to witness a miracle or just the final cruel hope before the inevitable end. The flatline monitor didn't just flicker, it spiked, then found a rhythm, weak at first but unmistakably a heartbeat, and the room erupted into controlled chaos as Dr. Reeves lunged for Daniel's wrist to check for a pulse, his fingers trembling as they pressed against skin that had been cold moments ago but now radiated warmth. And he looked up at his team with eyes wide enough to show white all around, because in 20 years of medicine he'd never seen cellular death reverse itself, had never watched a heart restart without compressions or drugs or defibrillation, had never witnessed anything that his training could explain. Lina stepped back from the bed, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. And she wasn't crying from joy exactly, but from overwhelming awe mixed with terror because she'd prayed for miracles before, had begged God to save her own son 2 decades ago, and heard only silence. And she didn't understand why this prayer had been answered when that one hadn't. Didn't know whether to feel grateful or guilty, or both. Catherine rushed to Daniel's bedside, her hands hovering over his face as color bloomed in his cheeks like watercolor spreading across paper, his lips losing that blue-gray tint, his chest rising and falling on its own for the first time in 48 hours without the ventilator doing the work. And she was laughing and sobbing simultaneously, reaching for Edward's hand without thinking. And for a moment, they were just two parents watching their child come back from the edge of death. All their history temporarily forgotten. Edward gripped her hand, but couldn't take his eyes off Lina, off this woman who'd lived in his house for 12 years, and who he'd barely seen, had treated as invisible, had paid generously but never really thanked, never really acknowledged as the person who'd raised his son while he built his empire. And the realization hit him like a physical blow that she'd saved Daniel, that her faith had accomplished what all his money and power couldn't touch. And something shifted in his chest, some recognition that felt dangerously close to reverence. Dr. Reeves was barking orders now, calling for tests, for blood work, for a full cardiac panel and neurological assessment. His scientific mind already trying to categorize this event, to find the medical explanation, because there had to be one. There was always a rational answer, even if they hadn't discovered it yet. We need to understand what happened here, Reeves said, his voice tight with an emotion that might have been excitement or fear. This could be a temporary rally, or there could be brain damage from oxygen deprivation, or... But Edward cut him off, his voice low and fierce. You said he was dead. You said there was nothing more you could do. So maybe you don't understand everything about life and death after all, Doctor. The words came out harder than Edward intended, but he was riding an adrenaline wave that made his hands shake and his vision sharp, and for the first time in months he felt something other than helpless despair. Felt instead a blazing determination that if his son was getting a second chance, then everything was going to change. Starting with Edward himself. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, and Catherine leaned in close, whispering his name, and when his gaze finally locked onto her face, he smiled, actually smiled, and tried to speak, but his throat was too raw from intubation. So Catherine pressed her fingers to his lips and told him not to try, told him he was safe, told him Mommy was here, and Daddy was here, and everything would be okay now. But then Daniel's eyes found Lina standing in the corner, and he lifted one trembling hand toward her, and she came forward and took it. And he managed to rasp out 2 words that made every person in that room go absolutely still. She glows. Edward exchanged a confused look with Catherine, then turned to Dr. Reeves, who was already pulling out a penlight to check Daniel's pupils. Concerned about hallucinations or neurological damage, but Daniel kept staring at Lina with wonder in his eyes, kept trying to speak, and finally managed. Lina glows. Gold light. Like an angel. You don't see it. The nurses shifted uncomfortably because several of them had felt something in the room when Lina was praying. A presence or a warmth or a change in air pressure that their rational minds had dismissed. And now a child who'd been clinically dead was talking about seeing light around the woman who'd prayed him back to life. And it was either a miracle or a medical crisis or something that fell into the vast uncertain territory between. If this is giving you chills right now, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to go places you won't believe. Edward made a decision in that moment. Standing in that hospital room with his son alive against all odds, he decided that he didn't care what the doctors thought, didn't care about tests or explanations or scientific validation. He was taking Daniel home, was putting him in his own bed with his superhero sheets, was going to spend every single day actually being present in his son's life, and nothing and nobody was going to stop him. Mr. Vance, we can't discharge him. We don't know what caused this recovery, or if it's sustainable. We need to monitor him, run comprehensive tests. Dr. Reeves protested, but Edward was already pulling out his phone, already calling his lawyer, because if they wouldn't release Daniel voluntarily, then Edward would buy the entire hospital if necessary, would do whatever it took. Catherine surprised everyone by siding with Edward, her voice quiet but firm. He's been in this place for 6 weeks. He's been poked and scanned and monitored, and he's been dying the whole time. So maybe what he needs isn't here. And she looked at Lina when she said it. Really looked at her for perhaps the first time, seeing not just the maid, but the woman who'd loved their son faithfully and without agenda while they'd been too busy destroying each other. The hospital room had become a battleground. Doctors arguing for caution and protocol, parents demanding their child, and in the middle of it all, Daniel was squeezing Lina's hand and whispering that he'd seen something while he was dying, something important that he needed to tell them. And when the adults finally stopped arguing long enough to listen, he said words that would change everything. I wasn't supposed to come back, but she asked. And he said yes because she traded something. I heard it. And Lina went pale, her face draining of color. And Edward saw fear flash across her features before she hid it. And he wondered what secret she was carrying, what she knew that nobody else did, and whether the miracle they'd just witnessed had come with a price that hadn't been revealed yet. Edward brought Daniel home 3 days later, against medical advice, signing a mountain of liability waivers, while Dr. Reeves warned that the recovery was unexplained and could reverse at any moment, that they were gambling with the boy's life. But Edward had stopped trusting doctors and started trusting something deeper. Something he couldn't name, but that had everything to do with the quiet woman who'd prepared Daniel's room exactly as he'd left it, and who seemed to avoid eye contact with Edward ever since Daniel had mentioned a trade. The estate felt different now. The massive house that had always seemed cold and empty, suddenly warm because Daniel was in it, because Edward had moved his entire office home and cancelled every meeting for the foreseeable future, shocking his board of directors and his executive team, who'd never seen their ruthless CEO choose anything over business. Catherine visited daily, spending hours in Daniel's room reading to him or watching movies, and the strange truce between her and Edward was holding. But tension crackled underneath, because Catherine had noticed something that made her uncomfortable. The way Edward's gaze followed Lina whenever she entered a room, the way he'd started asking her to join them for meals, instead of eating separately in the kitchen, the way he looked at her like she was a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. Lina felt the attention like sunlight that was too intense, scorching rather than warming, because Edward Vance was a dangerous man to be noticed by, powerful and intense and grieving, and grief made people do irrational things, made them assign meaning where there was only coincidence, made them see connections that didn't exist. She'd tried to maintain distance, to slip back into a role as invisible household help, but Edward wouldn't allow it, kept asking her questions about her faith, about what she'd felt in the hospital room, about what Daniel meant when he said she'd traded something. And Lina deflected every inquiry with practiced ease, because the truth was too complicated and too painful, and nobody would believe her anyway. Daniel continued improving in ways that baffled the doctors who came to the house for daily checkups. His blood work showing cellular regeneration that was medically impossible, his energy returning, his appetite healthy, and by the end of the first week he was walking in the gardens with Lina, showing her where new flowers had bloomed while he'd been in the hospital. And during one of these walks, he asked her quietly, "What did you give up for me, Lina? I heard you promise something when I was in the in-between place." And she told him he'd been hallucinating, that near-death experiences created false memories. But Daniel had his father's sharp mind and knew evasion when he heard it. Edward watched them from his study window, watched the easy affection between his son and this woman, the way Daniel leaned into her like he'd never leaned into Edward, and jealousy mixed with gratitude created a confusing emotional cocktail that kept him awake at night, thinking about how a person could live in his house for 12 years and remain a stranger. How he'd been so blind to everything that actually mattered. He started finding excuses to be wherever Lina was, started conversations about Daniel's childhood that revealed how little Edward knew about his own son's life, what books he loved, what made him laugh, what he dreamed about. And Lina knew all of it because she'd been paying attention while Edward had been building his fortune. One evening, 2 weeks after Daniel came home, Edward found Lina in the library reshelving books, and instead of walking past like he would have a month ago, he stopped it and asked her about the son she'd lost, the baby she'd never mentioned, but that he'd discovered while having his investigator run a background check, because he needed to understand who this woman really was. Lina froze, her back going rigid, and when she turned to face him, her eyes were blazing with anger and hurt. "You investigated me? You went digging into the worst moments of my life without asking." And Edward had the decency to look ashamed, but he didn't apologize, just said, "I need to know who saved my son. I need to understand what happened in that hospital room." And Lina's voice came out low and fierce. "You want to understand. You want to categorize it and make sense of it like one of your business deals. Some things don't fit into spreadsheets, Mr. Vance. Some things require faith, not analysis." They were standing too close now, the air between them charged with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite attraction, but contained elements of both, and Edward found himself noticing details he'd never registered before. The gold flecks in her brown eyes, the strength in her jaw, the silver threading through her dark hair, and he felt something shift in his chest that terrified him, because Catherine was barely out of his life, and his son was barely out of crisis, and the last thing he needed was to develop feelings for his housekeeper. Catherine walked in at exactly that moment, saw them standing close enough to be intimate, saw the way Edward was looking at Lina, and her expression went cold. "Am I interrupting something?" And Edward stepped back quickly, professional distance reasserting itself. But the damage was done. Catherine had seen it, and the next day she arrived with her lawyer and papers requesting primary custody of Daniel, claiming that Edward's judgment was compromised, that he'd become unstable and obsessed with mysticism, that he was involving their son in an unhealthy fixation with the maid. The custody fight exploded like a grenade in the fragile peace, and Daniel heard his parents screaming at each other like the old days, heard his mother call Lina a manipulator and a fraud, heard his father defend her with a passion that seemed about more than just gratitude, and the stress made Daniel sick again, fever spiking, weakness returning, and Dr. Reeves arrived grim-faced to tell them that the recovery was failing, that whatever had healed Daniel was wearing off, and they were running out of time again. Edward confronted Lina that night, desperate and angry, demanding she do whatever she'd done before, pray again, make another trade. And Lina finally broke, finally screamed at him that she couldn't, that the price for Daniel's first healing had been every remaining miracle she'd ever be granted, that she'd bargained away her own future, answered prayers to save his son, and now there was nothing left to trade. no more deals to make. And if Daniel was dying again, then maybe it meant her faith hadn't been enough after all. And the confession shattered something in both of them. Lina's confession hung in the air like smoke. And Edward stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. That she'd traded her own future miracles for his son's life. And his first instinct was to call her crazy, to dismiss it as religious delusion. But then he remembered Daniel's heartbeat returning from nothing, remembered the impossible recovery, and he found himself asking in a whisper, how does that even work? How do you trade prayers? And Lina collapsed into a chair, exhausted and defeated, and told him a story she'd never told anyone. 23 years ago, when her son Gabriel was dying, she'd made a deal with God, offered her own life in exchange for his, begged to trade places, and in the darkness of that NICU, she'd heard something, not a voice exactly, but a knowing, a presence that had communicated without words that her son's suffering was ending, that he'd lived the exact life he was meant to live, even if it was only 4 days long, but that her grief wouldn't be wasted, that she'd be given opportunities to mother children who needed her, and that 3 times in her life she could ask for miracles for these children and they would be granted. But after the 3rd time, the gift would close, and she'd have to walk by faith alone like everyone else. Edward wanted to call it insane, wanted to laugh it off as grief-induced hallucination, but something in her face stopped him, a certainty that had nothing to do with trying to convince him, and everything to do with simply stating facts. Daniel was the 3rd, Lina said quietly. There was a little girl I nannied when I was 25. She wandered into a pool and drowned, was underwater for 6 minutes. And I pulled her out and prayed, and she came back with no brain damage. The doctors called it impossible, and her parents called it luck, and I knew it was one. Then there was a boy I cared for who had leukemia, stage 4, given weeks to live, and I sat with him through his last night and asked for number 2, and in the morning the cancer was just gone, completely gone. The oncologist published papers about spontaneous remission, and I knew it was 2. I thought I'd save the 3rd forever, thought I'd be so careful about when to use it, but then Daniel was dying, and I couldn't. I just couldn't let him go, so I used the last one, and now there's nothing left. Edward felt the room tilting, felt his entire understanding of reality shifting, because he was a man who dealt in facts and figures and market analysis, who'd built his empire on logic and strategy. And here was a woman telling him she'd had 3 miracles to spend, and she'd spent the last one on his son. And the terrifying thing was that he believed her, completely and absolutely believed her. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his, and the gesture was intimate, in a way that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with one human being recognizing another's sacrifice. You gave up something irreplaceable for Daniel, for my son, and I don't know how to even begin to thank you or repay you or... But Lina cut him off. You don't repay grace, Edward. That's not how it works. I didn't do it for thanks or reward. I did it because I loved that boy and I couldn't watch him die. And it was the first time she'd ever used his first name, had always called him Mr. Vance with careful professional distance. And the intimacy of hearing his name in her voice cracked something open in his chest. They sat in charged silence for a moment that stretched too long, and Edward realized he was still holding her hands. Realized how close they were. Realized that somewhere in the past 2 weeks, his gratitude had transformed into something deeper and more complicated. And when Lina met his eyes, he saw that she felt it too, this dangerous pull between them. And she withdrew her hands quickly, standing up and putting distance between them. This can't happen, she said firmly. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, it's just gratitude and stress and crisis. It's not real. But Edward stood too, and his voice was rough when he said, "Don't tell me what I feel. I know the difference between gratitude and—" But he stopped because he wasn't ready to name it, wasn't ready to admit that he was falling for a woman he'd barely noticed, until she saved everything he loved. The moment shattered when Catherine's voice cut through from the doorway. "This is perfect! Absolutely perfect!" And they both spun to see her standing there, with her phone raised, recording. "Wait until the judge sees this. The great Edward Vance seducing the help while our son is upstairs dying again. This will make the custody hearing so much simpler." Edward's face went dark with rage. "Get out, Catherine! This isn't what it looks like!" But Catherine laughed, bitter and sharp. "Really? Because it looks like you're so obsessed with your miracle maid that you've forgotten Daniel is sick again. Did you even check on him in the last hour? Did you notice that Dr. Reeves is up there right now running tests because Daniel's vitals are crashing?" The words hit Edward like a physical blow, and he was running for the stairs before Catherine finished speaking, and Lina was right behind him. And when they burst into Daniel's room, they found the boy unconscious, his skin gray again, his breathing shallow, and Dr. Reeves looked up with devastation in his eyes. "It's happening faster this time. His body is shutting down, and I don't know why or how to stop it." Edward turned to Lina with wild, desperate eyes. "Pray again. Please, you have to try." But Lina was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "I told you. There's nothing left. I used them all." And Edward grabbed her shoulders, his voice breaking. "Then what do we do? How do I save my son?" And Lina's response changed everything. "Maybe you're asking the wrong question. Maybe this isn't about Daniel dying. Maybe something else is making him sick, something we haven't seen." And Dr. Reeves frowned, catching onto her thought. "What are you suggesting?" And Lina's voice was steady, despite her tears. "I'm suggesting that Daniel was healed completely, that the miracle worked, so if he's dying again, it's not the same disease. It's something new, something you haven't tested for because you've been so focused on the original condition." And Reeves went very still, his mind racing through possibilities he'd dismissed, and he started barking orders for new tests, different panels, and Edward looked at Lina with something that might have been awe, or might have been love, and wondered when exactly this woman had become the center of his entire world. The new test revealed something that made Dr. Reeves go pale. Daniel wasn't dying from his original disease, but from poisoning, systematic heavy metal toxicity that had been building in his system for weeks. And the revelation sent shockwaves through the house, because poisoning meant someone had deliberately been making Daniel sick. And suddenly everyone was looking at each other with suspicion and fear, and the question of who would want to hurt a child. Catherine immediately accused Lina, her voice shrill with accusation. "She's been giving him food, special meals. She has access to everything, and we only have her word about these so-called miracles. Maybe she made him sick in the first place to make herself seem important, to manipulate Edward." And the accusation was so vicious and so perfectly designed to create doubt that Edward saw several staff members nodding, saw even Dr. Reeves looking at Lina with new wariness. Lina's face went white, her voice shaking as she defended herself. "I would never hurt Daniel. I love him. You know I love him." But Catherine was relentless, already calling her lawyer, already demanding that police be contacted. And within hours there were detectives in the Vance estate, asking questions and taking samples from the kitchen and looking at Lina like she was a criminal. Edward wanted to defend her, wanted to throw everyone out and declare her innocence. But doubt had been planted, poisonous and insidious, because he realized he didn't actually know Lina beyond the surface, didn't know what she was capable of. And what if Catherine was right? What if the miracles were manipulation? What if he'd been played by a woman smart enough to exploit a desperate father? The thought made him sick, but he couldn't completely dismiss it. And when he looked at Lina with questions in his eyes instead of trust, something broke in her expression, something that looked like her heart shattering in real time. The police found traces of arsenic in a bottle of vitamins in Lina's cottage, placed there by someone who knew exactly how to frame her, and they arrested her despite her protests, despite Daniel crying out from his bed that Lina would never hurt him. Despite everything, and Edward stood frozen, watching them put handcuffs on the woman who'd saved his son. The woman he'd been falling in love with, and he did nothing to stop it because fear had paralyzed him. Fear that if he was wrong about her, then he was risking Daniel's life, and he couldn't take that chance. Lina looked at him as they led her away, and the betrayal in her eyes destroyed him, and she said quietly, "I thought you understood. I thought you believed, but you're just like everyone else. You only have faith when it's convenient." And then she was gone, taken to county jail, and Edward was left standing in his mansion that suddenly felt like a mausoleum. Daniel's condition continued deteriorating, despite the poisoning being identified, because the damage was already done, his organs struggling, and Dr. Reeves said they needed to find the source, needed to know what specific compounds were used so they could treat effectively. But with Lina in jail and not talking, she'd refused to say anything without a lawyer, had gone completely silent. They were running out of time. Catherine filed an emergency custody motion, presenting the video of Edward and Lina's intimate moment, presenting character witnesses who testified that Edward had been erratic and obsessed, and the judge granted temporary custody to Catherine, ordered that Daniel be moved to her penthouse as soon as he was stable enough for transport. And Edward felt his entire world disintegrating, his son being taken, the woman he loved in jail accused of poisoning, his company stock plummeting because news of the scandal had leaked and investors were panicking. He sat in Daniel's room that night, watching his son sleep restlessly, fever bright and fragile. And Edward finally confronted the truth he'd been avoiding his entire life. That he destroyed everything he touched, had destroyed his marriage through neglect, had nearly destroyed his son by prioritizing work over family, and now he destroyed Lina by doubting her when she needed him most. He thought about visiting her in jail, about apologizing, but shame kept him frozen, and meanwhile, Lina sat in a cell trying to pray, but finding the words wouldn't come. Finding that for the first time since Gabriel died, she felt completely alone, abandoned not just by Edward, but by God, because she'd given everything, and it still wasn't enough. Daniel was still dying, and now she was accused of causing it, and the man she'd stupidly allowed herself to care for had looked at her with suspicion instead of faith. The darkest thoughts came at 3 a.m. when Lina realized that maybe Catherine was right. Maybe she had made everything worse. Maybe her interference had disrupted some natural order, and now Daniel was suffering because of her pride in thinking she could bargain with God. And the despair was suffocating, made worse by the fact that she couldn't even be with Daniel in what might be his final days. Edward received a call at dawn from Dr. Reeves with worse news. They'd found the source of the poisoning. It was in Daniel's prescription medication. Someone had been systematically contaminating his pills, and the discovery should have exonerated Lina, except that the medication had been in her care. She'd been the one administering it, and so it just made her look more guilty. Catherine arrived with movers to collect Daniel, and Edward tried to fight it, tried to argue that moving him was dangerous. But the court order was clear, and Catherine's smile was triumphant. "You lost, Edward. You lost our son, and you lost your dignity over a woman who is poisoning him. and I hope it was worth it. And she said it in front of Daniel, who was awake, and crying, and begging not to leave. The moment they took Daniel out of the house, Edward collapsed, actually fell to his knees in the empty room, and for the first time since childhood he sobbed. Great, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and wounded, because he'd finally learned to love, had finally understood what mattered, and it was all being ripped away as punishment for the years he'd wasted. His phone rang, his lawyer calling to say that the custody case was essentially lost, that the evidence was overwhelming, and also that Lina's bail had been set at $500,000, and she had no way to pay it, and would likely sit in jail for months waiting for trial. Edward made a decision then, in that destroyed moment on the floor of his son's empty room. He would mortgage everything, would sell his company if necessary, would burn his entire empire to the ground to save Lina and get Daniel back, because he finally understood that love required sacrifice, required faith even when evidence suggested doubt, required showing up even when you'd already failed. And if there was any chance to make this right, then he would take it no matter the cost. But first he needed to figure out who had actually poisoned his son. And he had less than 24 hours before Daniel would be completely beyond his reach. And has anyone watching ever felt this kind of desperate hopelessness, where everything you love is slipping through your fingers? Because if so, drop a comment and let me know you understand this pain. Edward posted to Lina's bail at 6 a.m., liquidating personal assets to get the cash. And when she walked out of county jail 12 hours after being arrested, she looked smaller somehow, diminished. And when she saw him waiting, she didn't run to him or thank him, just stood there with exhausted eyes and said, "Why now? Why believe me now when you didn't last night?" And Edward had no good answer except the truth. Because I was a coward. Because fear made me doubt what my heart knew was true. And I'm sorry. I'm so desperately sorry. And I know that's not enough, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to make this right. Lina wanted to stay angry, wanted to nurse the wound of his betrayal, but she saw something different in Edward's face, something raw and broken open, and she realized that his doubt had hurt him as much as it had hurt her, that he was learning to trust for maybe the first time in his calculating life. They drove back to the estate in tense silence until Edward finally said, "I don't think you poisoned Daniel. I never really thought it. I was just afraid of being wrong and losing him. But I know you love my son, and I know you wouldn't hurt him, and I need your help to figure out who did." And Lina felt something shift, felt hope flicker in the darkness, and she asked, "What do you need me to do?" Edward had spent the night after Daniel was taken doing what he did best, investigating, analyzing, following money trails, and he discovered something disturbing. Catherine's finances were a disaster. She'd been living beyond her means for years, had gambling debts that she'd hidden during the divorce, and 3 months ago she'd taken out a massive life insurance policy on Daniel with herself as the sole beneficiary. The revelation made Lina's blood run cold. "You think Catherine is poisoning him? Her own son?" And Edward's face was grim. "I think she's desperate and addicted and capable of justifying anything. And I think she saw an opportunity when Daniel got sick. A way to solve her financial problems while blaming it on his original illness. And when he miraculously recovered, she panicked and had to make him sick again. They needed proof, needed something concrete, before they could go to police or a judge. And Lina remembered something. A moment 3 weeks ago when Catherine had visited, and Lina had found her in the kitchen crushing pills. And Catherine had said she was making them smaller for Daniel because he had trouble swallowing. And Lina had thought nothing of it at the time, but now the memory took on sinister weight. Edward called his head of security, a former FBI agent named Thomas, and explained the situation. and within an hour they had a plan. Edward would go to Catherine's penthouse under the pretense of visiting Daniel, would wear a hidden camera and microphone, and would try to get her to confess while Lina and Thomas monitored from a van outside. It was dangerous and probably illegal and might not even work, but it was all they had, and Edward was willing to risk everything for the truth. Before he left, Edward turned to Lina and took her face in his hands, a gesture so tender and unexpected that her breath caught, and he said, "When this is over, when Daniel is safe, I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't gratitude or crisis bonding. It's real. You've made me believe in things I thought were fairy tales, and whether you can forgive me or not, I need you to know that you changed my life." Lena's eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "Save our boy first. Then we'll talk about us." And the way she said "our boy" made Edward's heart clench with hope and determination. He arrived at Catherine's penthouse at noon, was let in by her assistant, and found Daniel in bed looking worse than ever, and his son's face lit up when he saw his father. "Dad, I knew you'd come. I told Mom you wouldn't abandon me." And the words were knives in Edward's chest because he had abandoned Daniel. Not physically, maybe, but emotionally for years. Catherine entered the room with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Edward, this is unexpected. The custody order says supervised visits only." And Edward forced himself to stay calm, to play the part. "I know. I just needed to see him. Needed to make sure he's okay. You're his mother, and you love him, and I trust you to take care of him." And he watched Catherine's face carefully, watched suspicion war with ego. He spent 20 minutes talking to Daniel, holding his hand, apologizing for everything. And then Catherine suggested Daniel rest and led Edward to the living room. And once they were alone, Edward started the real work, talking about his financial troubles with the company, mentioning that the scandal was destroying him, and Catherine's eyes gleamed with barely concealed satisfaction. Edward pushed further, said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about how I lost everything. And you're right. I invested everything in the wrong things. But you were smart. You protected yourself. I heard you have good insurance policies. And it was a fishing expedition. But Catherine took the bait. Couldn't resist bragging. I've always been better at planning than you, Edward. You're all instinct and risk while I think long term. And yes, I made sure Daniel and I would be taken care of no matter what happens." The phrasing was odd. That no matter what happens, and Edward felt ice in his veins but kept his voice casual. "That's smart, especially with Daniel being so sick. I mean, if something happened, you'd at least have financial security." And Catherine's mask slipped for just a second, something cold and calculating flashing across her face before she caught herself. She stood abruptly. "You should go, Edward. Daniel needs rest, and you're not supposed to be here." But Edward pressed, "Catherine, tell me the truth. Are you making him sick? Is this about money?" And the question hung in the air like a grenade, and Catherine's laugh was brittle and wrong. "That's insane! You're insane! The maid poisoned him, and you're so obsessed with her that you can't see it. Now get out before I call the police." Edward left, but he'd seen what he needed in her eyes. The flash of guilt and fear. And when he got back to the van, Lina and Thomas had recorded everything, and Thomas said, "It's not a confession, but it's enough to get a warrant, enough to search her place and test Daniel's current medications." And he was already calling his contacts in the police department. The pieces were falling into place. Hope was building, and Edward looked at Lina and saw the same determination in her face that he felt in his chest. They were going to save Daniel and expose Catherine and somehow make a family out of this broken, beautiful mess. But first they had to move fast because Catherine was spooked now, and desperate people did desperate things. And if you're invested in seeing justice happen, please subscribe because the next part is where everything explodes. Catherine disappeared with Daniel within 2 hours of Edward's visit, and when police arrived at her penthouse with a warrant, they found it empty, except for a housekeeper who said Mrs. Stratton had packed quickly and left in a private car heading to the airport. And Edward felt panic rising because Catherine was running and she had their son, and there was no telling what a cornered, desperate woman might do. Thomas tracked Catherine's phone to a private airfield, 40 minutes outside the city, where she'd chartered a jet to the Cayman Islands. No extradition treaty, and she clearly planned to disappear with Daniel and wait for the insurance payout after he died in a foreign hospital where questions wouldn't be asked. Edward chartered his own helicopter and took Lina with him, despite Thomas's protests that civilians shouldn't be involved. But Edward wasn't leaving her behind. Not anymore. They were doing this together, and they lifted off with police coordination happening below, law enforcement racing to the airfield, but Edward's helicopter was faster, would get there first. Lina prayed during the flight, not asking for miracles because she had none left to claim, but simply asking for Daniel's protection, for justice, for truth to win. And Edward held her hand and prayed too in his fumbling, uncertain way. And it felt right. Felt like they were united, not just in purpose, but in faith. They landed at the airfield just as Catherine was walking Daniel across the tarmac toward a waiting Gulf Stream, and the boy looked barely conscious, and Edward jumped from the helicopter before it fully touched down, running toward them, shouting Catherine's name. Catherine spun around, her face twisted with rage and fear, and she grabbed Daniel closer. "Stay back, Edward. He's my son, and I'm taking him somewhere he'll get proper care away from your circus." But Daniel was awake enough to struggle weakly, to cry out, "Dad!" And the sound broke Edward's heart and fueled his determination. Lina approached from the other side, moving carefully, her voice calm and steady. "Catherine, you don't want to do this. You love Daniel. I know you do. The gambling and the debt and the pressure. Those things made you desperate. But they're not who you are. You're his mother, and some part of you is screaming right now to stop this." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. I lost everything in the divorce. Everything. And the debts kept growing, and they threatened me. Said they'd hurt Daniel if I didn't pay. So I thought if I could, the insurance would solve everything, and he was dying anyway. The doctors said he was dying, so I'd be speeding up the inevitable and solving the problem." And the confession spilled out like poison draining from a wound. The terrible logic of a mind that had convinced itself that murdering her son was somehow protecting him. Edward inched closer, his voice gentle, despite the rage burning in his chest. "Catherine, Daniel didn't die. He was healed. You saw the miracle. But then you kept poisoning him because you needed the money more than you needed your son. And that's not love. That's not protection. That's murder." And the word landed like a physical blow, and Catherine crumpled, actually fell to her knees, still clutching Daniel, sobbing. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do. I'm so tired. I'm so scared." Lina knelt beside her, gently taking Daniel from her arms, and Catherine let him go, her fight completely gone, and Lina held the boy close while Edward called for medical help. And Daniel whispered, "Lina, you came. I knew you would. Mom's sick. She needs help too." And even after everything, that child had compassion for his mother, had inherited Catherine's tender heart before addiction, and desperation had twisted hers. The police arrived and took Catherine into custody, and she went quietly, looking back at Daniel with devastation in her eyes. And Edward felt pity mixed with his anger, because he understood now how people broke, how desperation could corrupt even parental love. Daniel was rushed to the nearest hospital, where doctors began chelation therapy to remove the arsenic from his system. And this time the prognosis was good because they'd caught it early enough, because the original miracle healing had left him strong enough to fight. And within hours, his vitals were stabilizing. Edward and Lina stayed by his bedside, and at one point, Daniel looked at them with knowing eyes beyond his years and said, "You two love each other. I can see it. It's okay, you know. It makes me happy." And Edward and Lina exchanged glances that held everything they'd been through, all the doubt and fear and faith and sacrifice. And Edward said, "Your son is very perceptive." And Lina smiled. "He gets that from his father." And it was the first time she'd acknowledged that Edward was trying to actually be the father Daniel deserved. The most surprising twist came 3 days later, when Catherine's lawyers brought a statement she'd written from jail. A confession not just to the poisoning, but to planting the evidence in Lina's cottage, to manipulating the custody case, and also a revelation that changed everything. Catherine had been diagnosed with a brain tumor 6 months ago, small but growing in her frontal lobe, affecting judgment and impulse control, and she'd hidden it from everyone, had been deteriorating mentally while trying to manage crushing debt. And the combination had created the perfect storm for tragedy. Edward felt his anger transform into grief, because Catherine wasn't a monster. She was sick and desperate, and had made terrible choices, but she was also Daniel's mother, and once upon a time Edward had loved her. And he told the prosecutors he wouldn't push for maximum sentencing, would support treatment and psychiatric care, would make sure she got help. And Daniel cried when he heard and hugged his father and said, "Thank you for not hating her." Charges against Lina were dropped completely, her record expunged, and the district attorney issued a public apology. But the real victory was smaller and more personal. It was Daniel coming home 2 weeks later, fully recovered, no trace of poison in his system, the original disease still miraculously gone. And it was Edward setting up a schedule where he only worked 4 hours a day and spent the rest of his time with his son. And it was Lina, no longer living in the cottage, but in the main house as family, not staff. And it was the three of them eating dinner together every night and laughing and healing. If this resolution is hitting you right in your heart, leave a comment telling me what part made you feel the most. I love hearing from you all. Edward took Lina to the hospital chapel one evening, a month after everything settled. The same chapel where she'd prayed before saving Daniel. And he said, "You told me you used your last miracle for my son, that you have no more guaranteed prayers. But I've been thinking about that, and I realized something. Maybe the real miracle wasn't just Daniel's healing. Maybe it was all of this, the way everything fell apart and came back together, the way we found each other, the way even Catherine's tragedy is leading to treatment and hope. Maybe that's the miracle too." And Lina smiled through tears and said, "Maybe faith isn't about guaranteed answers. Maybe it's about trusting that love wins even when the path is terrible." And Edward kissed her then, finally, completely, and it felt like coming home. And when they walked out of that chapel hand in hand, they found Daniel waiting for them with a grin on his face that said he'd known this was coming all along. And the three of them walked out into the evening air together, a family built not from perfection, but from brokenness, made whole, from wealth humbled and poverty elevated, from science and faith finally working together, and from love that had been tested in fire and emerged stronger than diamonds. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the backyard of the Vance estate with a soccer ball at his feet, fully recovered and stronger than he'd been even before the illness. And he kicked the ball to his father, who actually caught it this time. who'd been practicing every evening after work because Edward Vance had learned that being present required effort and repetition and showing up even when you weren't naturally good at something. Lina watched from the porch with a cup of tea, wearing jeans instead of her old uniform. Her status in the household transformed from employee to something that didn't have a neat label yet, but felt like family, felt like home. And Edward caught her eye across the lawn and smiled in a way that still made her heart skip. Because some miracles came in quiet moments, rather than dramatic hospital room resurrections. Catherine was in a treatment facility upstate, a place Edward paid for that specialized in both addiction recovery and post-tumor psychiatric care. And Daniel visited her twice a month, with either Edward or Lina accompanying him. And the visits were hard but healing. Catherine slowly becoming herself again as treatment progressed. The desperate woman who'd poisoned her son giving way to the mother who wept with remorse and gratitude that he'd survived her worst self. She'd written Daniel a letter that he kept in his nightstand, an apology that was raw and honest. And she'd written one to Lina too, thanking her for saving the son Catherine had nearly destroyed. And Lina had cried reading it, because she understood better than most how grief and desperation could break a person, how grace was the only thing that could put them back together. Edward had stepped back from daily operations at Vance Industries, promoting his COO to CEO and taking a chairman role that required minimal hours. And the company had thrived without his constant control, because he'd learned that his need to micromanage everything came from the same fear that had made him doubt Lina. The fear that if he wasn't controlling every variable, then everything would fall apart. But life had taught him that the best things happened when he let go and trusted. Daniel was back in school, thriving academically and socially, and his story had spread in quiet ways. Parents whispering about the boy who'd been dying and was healed. And some looked at Lina with awe, while others dismissed it as misdiagnosis. But Daniel knew the truth, and so did the people who mattered. And he'd started a prayer journal where he wrote down things he was grateful for, and Lina's name appeared on every single page. The romantic subplot that had begun in crisis and suspicion had evolved into something steady and real. Edward courting Lina properly with dinners and conversations that lasted hours, learning her story, her dreams, her faith, and Lina letting her walls down piece by piece, trusting that this powerful man had been genuinely transformed by nearly losing everything. He proposed 3 months after Catherine's arrest, not with a flashy public gesture, but in the kitchen where Lina was teaching Daniel to make his grandmother's recipe for empanadas. And Edward got down on one knee, right there on the tile floor, and said, "I don't deserve you, and I probably never will. But I'm asking anyway because you taught me that grace isn't about deserving, it's about love. And I love you, Lina Wolf. I love your faith and your strength, and the way you love my son. And I'm asking you to marry me not to be Daniel's stepmother because you already are his mother in every way that counts, but to be my wife, my partner, my reminder that miracles are real." And Lina said yes through tears while Daniel cheered and hugged them both. They married in a small ceremony 2 months later in the hospital chapel where Lina had prayed Daniel back to life. The same place where Edward had learned to pray, and Dr. Reeves attended looking emotional because he'd witnessed something in that family that had challenged everything his medical training taught him about the limits of science. And he'd started attending church again for the first time in 20 years. Started wondering if maybe there was room for both evidence and faith in understanding how the world worked. Daniel was the ring bearer and took his job incredibly seriously, and Catherine sent a letter that Edward read during the reception, her blessing on the marriage, and her gratitude that Daniel would have Lina as a mother figure, while she worked on becoming healthy enough to be in his life again in smaller ways. The wedding was small, but perfect. Maybe 40 people, mostly Daniel's friends and their parents. some of Edward's business associates who'd stuck by him through the scandal, and the staff from the estate who'd watched this whole transformation happen and who loved Lina fiercely. Edward's vows made everyone cry, especially the part where he said, "You saved my son's life, but more than that, you saved mine. You taught me that wealth without love is poverty, that power without faith is weakness, that success without family is failure." And Lina's vows were simpler. "I promise to pray for you, to believe in you, to love Daniel as my own, and to remind you every day that miracles aren't finished, that God still moves, that love still wins." They honeymooned modestly, just a week at a beach house with Daniel because neither wanted to be apart from him. And they built sandcastles and collected shells and talked about the future, about maybe adopting children who needed homes, about using Edward's resources to fund medical research and help families facing impossible diagnoses, about building something meaningful from the tragedy they'd survived. A year after the wedding, Daniel asked if he could legally change his name to Daniel Vance Wolfe, wanting to carry both parents' names, and Edward and Lina agreed with full hearts. And Catherine signed the papers from her treatment center with shaking hands and a note that said she was proud of the man her son was becoming. The final scene of the story isn't dramatic, it's quiet. It's an ordinary Tuesday evening with Edward helping Daniel with algebra homework while Lina prepares dinner, and the house smells like garlic and tomatoes, and music plays softly from the kitchen speaker. And this is the miracle that matters most. Not the impossible healing or the dramatic rescue, but the daily choice to love, to show up, to believe that broken things can be made whole. Edward looked at his wife, moving around the kitchen, at his son bent over his textbook with his tongue sticking out in concentration, and he thought about the man he'd been a year ago, the billionaire who'd had everything and nothing, who'd been watching his only son die while the whole world watched. And he thought about how sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what actually matters. How sometimes the maid knows more than 1,000 doctors. How sometimes faith is the only medicine that works. To everyone who's watched this entire story, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for being here, for investing your time, for feeling these emotions with me. Please leave a comment and tell me what this story meant to you. Tell me if you've ever experienced a miracle or needed one. Tell me where you're watching from, and if this touched your heart. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do it now, because there are more stories coming that will move you, challenge you, and remind you that hope is real. The Vance Wolfe family didn't live happily ever after in the fairy tale sense. They lived authentically ever after, with struggles and growth and hard conversations and continued healing. But they lived it together, bound by a love that had survived the ultimate test. And on quiet evenings when Daniel was asleep and Edward and Lina sat on the porch watching stars, they sometimes talked about that night in the hospital, about the moment everything changed. And they agreed that the real miracle wasn't just that Daniel's heart started beating again, but that all of their hearts had learned to beat in rhythm. A family created not by blood alone, but by sacrifice, faith, and a love that proved what billions couldn't buy. A maid's faith had brought back, and what God in his mystery had made whole. Thank you so much for being part of this journey. Your time, your attention, your emotions invested in this story, they mean everything. I hope this reminded you that miracles still happen, that faith still moves mountains, and that love still wins. Please share this story with someone who needs hope today. God bless you all.